So we wrapped up a series in the book of James entitled Training with James. Small book, but packs a powerful punch. The potency of the themes that he addresses are vital to our walk with Christ and constantly reminds us of. No, you don't have to worry about it. So we are starting tonight a new series that I'm going to call Navigation. And when I say navigation, I mean navigating the current climate, the current world that we're living in as Christians. And that means a whole bunch of things, because if you look at the world today, you can see that things are getting more difficult for Christians here in the U.S. But tonight, to begin this series, I want to look at a familiar text to some, and to others this may be new to you, but for those that regularly have been in your scriptures for some time now, you would know this scripture as the one where we describe many times as counting the cost. I want to start here because I think it's important that as we talk about navigating the world that we live in, I think it's important that you understand what you're getting yourself into right now, not, just jump right into the series and you're like, oh, well, I didn't sign up for all that. When we get done tonight, you'll know that this is what I signed on for. You made this conscious decision to do so, and you'll move forward with Christ no matter how difficult things may get for us. So I want to start off by just reading verses 34 and 35 of Luke chapter 14. It says, and this is the ESV, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Be careful what you're hearing, is what Jesus is saying. And we'll kind of flash back to everything that's said before that. But before we do that, we find the Christian life difficult because we seek for God's blessing while we live according to our own will. Let me say that again. We seek for God's blessing while we're trying to live according to our own will. That's the reason why we find living the Christian life difficult. Yeah, there are times when people come up against you and we talk about persecution depending on what part of the world you're in. But for the most part, it's, I want to live this life, but I'm trying to do it in my own will, do it according to my plan, my project. And we kind of want Jesus to get on board with that. And then we find that difficult and we wonder why things don't work out. But that's not the way it is when Jesus calls people to follow him. We continue to make our own plans. We choose our own work. And then we just ask the Lord to watch and see that sin doesn't overcome us, right? And to help us not to wander too far off the path, right? This is my plan, God. Now watch, make sure sin don't get me. Make sure I stay on the path. But you were never on his path in the first place if it's all about our plans and our projects. And that's one of the things we have to really begin to understand as we're walking with him. And that's why we're talking about the costly commitment on this evening. Andrew Murray says this. He says, but our relationship to Jesus is to be such that we are entirely at his disposal. Every day we should go to him first, humbly and straightforward, and say, Lord, is there anything in me that is not according to your will, that has not been ordered by you, or that is not entirely given over to you? And he closes with this. He said, what would you have for me to do today? And just think about if that was our attitude in approaching God every day, figuring out what is it that you want me to do? Is there anything that needs to be cleaned up? And instead, we typically rise and think that we're going to get God on a board with what we got going on. And it doesn't work out like that. We've come to believe that we can be his students or believers, however way we want to say it, and watch from the sidelines and not get in the game. Think about that. We think we can be his believers or his students, those that learn from him. We can watch from the sideline and not get in the game. But Michael Wilcox says something that I think is very important for us to consider. Listen to what he says. He says, Jesus was calling not for spectators, but for recruits. When he called men to follow him, he meant them not to tag along behind him out of curiosity, but to throw in their lot with him in commitment. Listen to that. Don't just follow me back here and be kind of curious about what's going on. But he says, throw your lot in with me and be committed to me. That's something totally different. And I think Michael Wilcox is on point with what he said there. But there's three things we're going to look at, and then we'll close with some other remarks. But the three things, we'll examine people, which is in verse 26, and how they can hinder us from being his students. Second, we will discuss persecution in verse 27 and how fear can paralyze us to the point of turning away from Christ or simply refusing to be fully committed to him. And the third thing, we're going to look at possessions, right? The things we possess in verse 33 and our ties to them, they prove where our loyalty lies. And then I want to close by examining two illustrations of the importance of counting the cost, and that's going to be in verses 28 through 32. But let's look first at people in our lives, people. It's in verse 26 of Luke 14. He says, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and read verse 25 as well. So 25 and 26. Now great crowds accompanied him, right? That's Jesus and his disciples. And he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And just think about this strong language of hate. You know, nowadays we're so sensitive, everything is considered hate speech. But Jesus uses this strong language here. He's dealing with comparisons, not telling us to actually hate the people in our lives, not hating our family members. You get something similar in Matthew 10, verse 37. It says, if you love your father or mother more than you love me, you are not worthy of being mine. Or if you love your son or daughter more than me, you are not worthy of being mine. You belong to me now. Nothing should come before me in your life. Nothing. Not the people, not your stuff, which is something we're going to look at here in a little bit. Nothing comes before me is what he is saying. And I think it's something that we ought to take notice of. In this commentary on Luke, the author say this. It says, but the Aramaic word used for hate really means to love a great deal less. Just think about that. They go on to say this. I think Jesus means that if God and his kingdom are all-consuming importance, then all other loves are far less by comparison. Love a great deal less. See, you ever see somebody, they talk about how much they love the Lord, and then they get to talking about other people, and it's just like, they might try to put Jesus just like barely above somebody else, right? But he says that Aramaic word, it really carries the notion of loving these other individuals, these other relationships in your life much greater and lesser. These relationships must come under the authority of Christ, or we cannot be his students, or we can't learn from him. That's what he's saying. We cannot. Listen to him. Right? He says, anyone comes to me does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even your own life. He cannot be my disciple. To be someone's disciple means that you learn from them. We can't be students of Jesus if we have other people that are almost on the same level as him in our hearts. John Barry says this. He is not encouraging his followers to turn against their family members. Rather, he is explaining that even devotion to family does not supersede the call to discipleship. Jesus and God's kingdom must come first in the life of a believer. He says it does not supersede discipleship. Think about that. These relationships do not supersede you as a student of his. That means, listen to this, that doesn't mean that you just walk around and profess him even in front of family members. That means that learning from him takes a priority. That's what that means. If we're going to be his students, that means we learn from him. He's saying even our responsibility as his students takes a priority over these other relationships. That's something that's just hard for people to wrap their mind around. The priority to learn from him and to learn how to do what he did. We don't think about it like that. We think that, if I just show up at church, or man, if I just tell people I'm a Christian, that means something. But there's a priority in learning how to study the Bible and not just read the Bible. That's a priority in our lives. There's a priority in learning how to trust God at work. There's a priority in learning how to trust God at school. There's a priority on learning how to trust God around your neighbors, your family members when y'all get together. All of that. That's the priority. As his students, we learn these things. Grant Osborne says this. This is strong imagery for a total commitment to Jesus and a desire to serve him completely. He goes on to say this. The normal interpretation of this as love less than, he says that's just too weak. He said we ought to be obsessed, consumed with Jesus. We don't love our family less, we love Jesus more. Think about that. He said we ought to be obsessed. Yeah, have you ever seen somebody obsessed with another person? You ain't never seen any of these movies where like the Fatal Attraction or whatever, where the person is just tripping. They show up at your job. You ain't even call them up there. They just show up. How you doing? I thought we would have lunch together. What? Have lunch? How you even know why I work? You know what I mean? He's saying like you should be obsessed with me. You should be wanting to be up under me all the time. That's the language there. Be so obsessed with me that you're digging. You're like, man, I got to find everything I can out about Jesus. It's hard. And you know why it's hard is because we got stuff in the way. And here in the context here, in this part we're at, people get in the way. You know, in their culture, the family dynamic is important. Honor your mother and your father. Then you got your siblings, you got your spouse, you got your children, and he even threw yourself in there. All that stuff take a backseat to being his student. If they don't, if your love for Jesus is not way up here compared to everybody else way down here, you can't learn from it. You won't be able to learn the lessons that Jesus wants to teach us. It just won't happen. He says to love them less, right? He says that's too weak. Just to simply love your family, these people, a little bit less, he said that's too weak of language. And I would even argue it's a cop-out to just say, oh, I just love my family a little less. Jesus is a little bit more important to them. That's a cop-out. And that's how you know that people, regardless if they are family, can become an idol in your life and be the main reason why we cannot fully commit to Jesus. It's one of the main reasons. We don't admit that, but that's the truth. Family members, spouse, whoever, they can become an idol in our life. And we can't be fully committed because of these obstacles in our way. And I don't want to make it seem like family is an obstacle. Not like that. That's not what I'm saying. But family can become an obstacle if it becomes too high on a totem pole. Your spouse can become an idol, or your future spouse. Much of what you and I have been taught growing up won't line up with Christ. Won't line up. Stuff we hear from the world and in society about spouse, children, family members, all that stuff ain't gonna line up with Christ. But we don't want to hear that. We want to hear everything's gonna be good and blessed and God is just favoring you and he's just gonna give you everything. You ain't gotta worry about nothing. You ain't gotta change. You ain't gotta be transformed. It don't work like that. You want to be his students? People got to take a backseat to him. Because our lives can be so wrapped up, even in our children's lives, that everything is all about them. Everything. Everything. Going from this event to that event. Oh, my child is playing this sport this time, then they playing this sport, then they playing that sport, then they do this, then they got that rehearsal, then they got that. And then you like, I'm just tired. I ain't had no time to spend with the Lord. And it's like, wow, he's a priority. And this is why when you look at Jesus sometimes it's like he's trying to run people off. Because he wants you to understand. It's like him giving you the fine print up front. You know, on commercials, they say all the fluff stuff that sound good, like it's real loud, and then they put the little small fine print at the bottom. Jesus is like, I'm going to give you the fine print up front. I'm going to give you all the stuff that you need to understand what you're getting into, and then now you decide if you really want me. Because this walk with me ain't going to be easy. That's what Jesus is saying. Our family relationships that would typically come first in order of importance must now take a back seat. That's where it is. Even my life, my plans, my dreams, etc., that stuff got to take a back seat. But I want you to listen to something earlier in Luke chapter 9, verses 23 through 25. It says, then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but are yourself lost or destroyed? Remember, it does not say that Jesus won't let you be his disciple. He won't let you be a student. It says you won't be able to learn from him. You can't be my disciple if these other people come before me? That's the people in verse 26. Now let's look at persecution. It's in verse 27. He says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. You starting to see the pattern? There's certain things he's saying, if this doesn't happen, if this is not in place, you can't be my student. You can't learn from me. Listen to this here. I mean, just think about the concept of following, right? It reveals our trust in the one that we claim to follow. I want you to look at Matthew 11, 25 through 30 real quick. I want you to just listen to what he says here. It says, at that time, Jesus prayed this prayer. O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, thank you for hiding these things from those who think themselves wise and clever, and for revealing them to the childlike. Yes, Father, it please you to do it this way. My Father has entrusted everything to me. No one truly knows the Son except the Father, and no one truly knows the Father except the Son, and to whom the Son chooses to reveal them. Just think of the childlike that he's talking about here. The childlike, in some places you can really translate it as infants. It's the idea of those who don't think they know everything, right? You see little children, they're trying to soak up everything they can from you. They're always watching and looking. It's a little bit more, it's a little different than the ones that think they are established and know some stuff, right? He says the wise and understanding ones. He says these infants, they are the kind of people who can learn from Jesus. And as his students, that's how we got to come in. We got to come in like the children that are totally dependent, totally trusting, and understanding that I don't know nothing. I need to follow you because you know everything pertaining to life. But what does following look like in action? First, it's not knowing where you are going. Think about that. You want to follow Jesus, you must come to the realization that there are going to be times as you follow him, you just simply don't know where you're going. You don't know where he's taking you that week. You don't know how long you're going to be in the season you in. You don't know any of that. And the second thing is, it's not knowing how the road is going to be to get there. You don't know where you're going at times, but then you don't know how difficult the road is going to be. It could be ease in this season of your life, but you might go through season after season right after one another and barely even get a break. You don't know, but the goal is to trust him regardless of what season lies ahead for you. And that's what it looks like to follow, right? That's what he's saying here. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Bear your own cross. Pick up your instrument of death. When you carry the cross, you carried it to your death. And in our day, it would be like the person on death row. It'll be something like, pick up that lethal injection table and grab those 3 needles while you're at it. Those are the ones we're going to put in your arm. That's what it would be like. But Grant Osborne says this. He says, bearing your own cross means that we become like Jesus on the road to Golgotha, who bore the crossbeam to his execution site. Listen to this. Signifying he was already dead. Think about that. Carrying means you're letting everybody else know I'm dead. I'm a dead man or woman walking. And that's the way it ought to be for us. He's saying, follow me and let everybody know you're dying. Not just dying physically, but you're dying to yourself. Your way of doing things, your way of thinking, your way of interacting with other people, and your way of how you thought you understood who God was. And then another way you can say it means this. Anything that may come against you and I for following Christ, carry it. Something might be coming up over here, I'm following. I'm bearing my cross. I know next week it may be some trouble coming my way because of what I post on YouTube, because of me speaking out against this and standing up for truth. Some may be coming my way, I don't know, but I cannot stop going in the direction that Christ is asking me to go just because some stuff might come. And it's going to come. The degree is what matters. We don't know at what degree it's going to come our way, but it's coming sooner or later. John G. Mason says this: discipleship carries with it the idea of submitting to the direction, that is the teaching and discipline of the teacher. So you submit, right, to the direction, his correction, his teaching, anything, his instructions, you submit to that. And then he says to the discipline of the teaching, of the teacher. What does that look like? Discipline could be two ways. You can look at that. It could be being corrected for something that I'm doing and I shouldn't have done. But discipline ourselves, like things like fasting and prayer and times of Sabbath and times of solitude and silence. It could be those type of spiritual disciplines, but it could also mean correcting. But John Mason goes on, he says, hatred in this context suggests subordinating everyone, including the nearest loved ones and everything, even life itself, to our commitment to Jesus. Subordinate everything. Everything comes under. Jesus is up here. People, fear of what may come my way, and anything else comes up under him because it's my commitment to Jesus. If we're honest, when we're looking at persecution here, if we're honest, there are times where fear paralyzes us, can cause us not to stand up for the truth and keep God's standard in certain circumstances, in certain settings, because we don't know what they may do to us by saying that is wrong. John 12:23-26 says this: Jesus replied, "Now the time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory. I'll tell you the truth. Unless a kernel of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone. But its death will produce many new kernels, a plentiful harvest of new lives. Those who love their life in this world will lose it. Those who care nothing for their life in this world will keep it for eternity. Anyone who wants to serve me must follow me, because my servant must be where I am, and the Father will honor anyone who serves me." Want to serve him? Want to be his follower? Any of that type of language, we must go with him, and he says they must be where I'm at. So you can't be a student or a follower of somebody from a distance. Jesus getting himself into some stuff back over there. What is going on over there with Jesus? Well, when they get through throwing stuff at him and yelling at him and spitting on him, I'll be over there then. It don't work like that. Where I'm going, you're going. Where I'm at currently, if it's in the midst of some chaos, we're there with him. We're his students. Grant Osborne says this. He says, "So this means that we die spiritually to self and the things of the world. In addition, it signifies a willingness to actually die for the name of Christ if need be." Listen to that. Let me read that part again. It says, "So this means that we die spiritually to self and the things of the world." Spiritually, I die to myself. The things of the world, whatever it is that I'm so attracted to or that I really want, I die to that as well. But he says, in addition, it signifies a willingness to actually die physically for the name of Christ if it need be. He goes on to say this: the verbs are present tense, meaning it is the continuous daily practice of our lives of dying to self. Christ likeness involves participating in his sufferings as we go all the way with Jesus. Daily, continuous action of dying to myself, my project, my plan, and going all the way, even if that means physical death, even if that means jail. Paul understood that, and some of the other disciples, and they boldly proclaimed. But we don't know nothing about that here in the U.S. because I guess it ain't got bad enough. There's some places in the world that it's almost guaranteed you going to jail if you're a Christian. I guess we didn't got so comfortable here in the U.S., it must not have gotten bad enough for us. Participating in his sufferings, like Philippians 3:10 says, as we go all the way with Jesus. You see, trust is vital, and it's by the grace of God that we succeed. That's the people. That's the persecution. Now let's look at possessions. It's in verse 33. He says, so therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciples. Oh, this right here is the good stuff right here. Yeah, this is the good part. All that you possess, all that you own. Renouncing, right? Turning one's back on, or giving up possession. Grant Osborne says this. He says the verb give up means to renounce or bid farewell to something formerly precious to us. Let's think about that. He said to bid farewell to something that was formerly precious to us. He goes on to say wealth in and of itself is not wrong, and in fact can be a gift from God. It is what you do with it that matters. Bid farewell. If need be, if God says give up your stuff, you're willing to bid farewell because it was precious to you at one moment. Just think of the attitude that's why some people right now, God don't have them, because their stuff is just too important. They claim their rights to it. It's the language of rejecting or refusing to use or no longer abiding by. That's the language here of renouncing. Everybody comes in with some stuff. It's what you already have. What you come into the relationship with. Just think of just in general. And this is not the perfect illustration, but just think of in general when you enter into a new relationship with somebody. You come in and they come in with some stuff. It's the same way. But Jesus takes precedence. You come in with your stuff, and that means we are willing to use our stuff for his purposes, his project, and not sit around and be like, I knew he was going to ask me to give up all this stuff. This don't even make no sense. What does this got to do with following you? But it's our concept of ownership is what the problem is. I'm going to show you what I mean. Walter Liefeld, he says this in his commentary. He says, his thought probably is that of abandonment of things, yielding up the right of ownership rather than outright disposal of them, right? So he's saying, Jesus is saying you give up the right of ownership to that. You might still hold on to it for right now until he says we need to use it for this. We need to use it to bless so-and-so. We need to use it to support this ministry. We need to use this to help them to pay their rent. We need to help them right here because they got bills to pay. These people finna get put out on the street. We need to use your stuff for my purposes. It's giving up the right. He goes on to say this: the disciple of Jesus may be given the use of things in trust as stewardship, but they are no longer his own. He goes on, he says, the present tense implies that what Jesus requires in relationship to possessions is a continual attitude of abandonment. What does that mean? Simply what I just said. Just as you no longer belong to you, neither does your stuff. It don't belong to you no more. It don't belong to me no more. It's to be used for God's purposes as he says. If he says tomorrow, go get that $500 out the bank and bless so-and-so because they need to pay this and they need to pay it, it'll be in our best interest to be obedient. Philippians 3:3-7 says this: for we who worship by the Spirit of God are the ones who are truly circumcised. We rely on what Christ Jesus has done for us. We put no confidence in human effort, though I could have confidence in my own effort, right? He goes in and talk about all of this stuff. He runs down his resume. But just notice that Paul says, in verse 7, I once thought that these things were valuable, but now I consider them worthless because of what Christ has done. Not only our resume to puff ourselves up about what we've done and what we've accomplished, but even our stuff. I used to count, man, I used to say this and I used to do this. And hear me, because some people hear that and think I'm saying that you're not supposed to save money. That's not what I'm saying. But if we get to the point, just like when we were in the book of James, if we see a Christian brother or sister in need and we know we have to take care of them and we just don't want to do it because we think, oh man, I was going to put that up, man. I was planning on doing this with that money. We're missing the mark. God has some purposes in plan. If we really trust that Christ is going to help us to be able to do some of the other stuff that we need to do, then we just simply need to trust him. I like this right here in Hebrews chapter 11. This is the verse 24-26. It says, it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. Instead of really benefiting in the king's castle, he said, you know what? Lay that stuff aside, because he was looking ahead to his great reward. But what if you are asked to give up your stuff? Remember the rich young ruler? He told him, give up everything and then come follow me. It says that in verse 22 of Matthew 10, at this, the man's face fell and he went away sad, for he had many possessions. And Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, how hard is it for the rich to enter the kingdom of God? How hard is it to enter into what God is doing, into his project for the world? Because you holding on to your stuff. John Berry again says this: Jesus sees an abundance of possessions as an hindrance to faith, right? To trust in him. He instructs his followers to rid themselves of anything that prevents a total commitment to God's kingdom. For many, this meant selling everything they had for the betterment of the impoverished and for the sake of spreading the news about Jesus. If he does ask us to give up something, it's for a reason. He ain't just saying get rid of that stuff. Every time he told somebody to give up their stuff, it was to go give it to the poor. And follow me. You're going to learn from me. And don't worry, we'll get some stuff back. Don't worry about it. Jesus didn't walk all over the place, town to town, village to village, through this country, over here, went over here. And then they had other people. It says at one time they had all these women that were supporting their ministry. God's people will be taken care of. Let me say this as we get ready to close here in a minute. If God does not have your stuff, he does not have you. I'm going to say that one more time. If God does not have your stuff, he does not have you. If you notice, I skipped over some verses. I wanted to kind of look at a few things, then I wanted to go back. But I want to pause and count the cost, and I want you to see why Jesus is saying all the stuff that he's saying. In verses 28 through 32 back in Luke 14, it says this: "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" Right? And then he goes on and says, "Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not first sit down and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes up against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other one is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace." Just think about it. He says, just think about these illustrations that he used. They illustrate the importance of wisdom in counting the cost. Don't just jump up because you're feeling emotional at the moment and they playing this song and it makes you cry and jump up and try to commit your life to Christ. Take the time, think about it, and guess what? Decide, is that really what I want to do with my life? And part of the problem is, I'm going to tell you right now, part of the problem is we have churches full of people that are not fully committed. We even got people in leadership that ain't fully committed. You got people in leadership that don't even really study their Bible, but they want to teach and preach. What kind of stuff is that? Take the time and think about what's before you, what it's going to be like with it, and how life is going to be without it. Jesus is calling me to him. What's it going to be like if I just reject him? What's that going to look like? Man, what is it going to look like if I decide to follow him? You should be taking the time to think about that. Proverbs 23, 1 through 3 says this: "When you sit down to dine with a ruler, consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are a person of great appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for it is deceptive." He said, even when you're in these situations, you ain't get ready to sit down and dine with a person, don't just sit there and just eat up everything and eat up anything. He said, consider what's really before you, because it may be something deceptive. Think about that. This is wisdom back in Proverbs to begin with. Jesus is bringing that full circle and saying, look, before you profess with your lips and claim to follow me and understand what all it entails, you better think about it. Practical skills or wisdom for everyday living protect us from the traps that are before us, and counting the cost is one form of such wisdom. I want to also share a little bit about my personal account of when I counted the cost. I was in the county jail. Some of y'all have heard this story before, others haven't. And being in the county jail, I hadn't even got my time for when I went to prison yet. And it's interesting. I wrestled for about a month, 3-4 weeks or something like that, just wrestling, reading the Bible for hours, up at night and just wrestling. And just by reading the scripture alone, I started seeing I can't do certain things that I used to do. And I started to think, and I want to share some of the questions that I had. Is it possible to live this way here in jail and then when I get out? That's what I wrestle with. If I stay in jail and I end up getting time, will I be able to live it out in here? I have to wrestle with that. And then when I do get out, whether I get out on bond and don't have to go to prison, or when I do go to prison and I get out on parole, is it possible to live it out there? And I had to wrestle with that there are not many positive examples of people that go to jail, talk about it in there, and then get out and actually live it. There's not a lot of positive examples. There are a lot of examples of people talking that game in jail, but get out and go back to doing what they were doing. But I had to wrestle with this. What were people who who have known me think of this decision that I made, and how will they begin to look at me? I have to wrestle with that question. People that knew me from being in the streets, and whether it was people that knew me when I was banging, whether people that knew me when I was selling drugs, whatever it was that they knew me from when I used to play basketball, people that knew me and now they see me, how are they going to start looking at me now that I'm over here talking about Jesus? Then I wrestle with what sort of changes will I have to make? What kind of changes? As one of his followers, what changes in my life do I have to make? And then one other one I'll share is, how will my relationships be different with people I've known, and then even the new people that I have in my life? What is my relationships are going to be like? It's something you got to wrestle with. You don't just say, oh yeah, I want Jesus because somebody told you need Jesus. Wrestle with why you need Jesus and say, man, I want to be fully committed to him. See, a lot of us ain't fully committed to anything in the first place, so we don't know how to commit to Jesus. We don't even commit to anything else in our regular lives. So in conclusion, I want to read what I read at the very beginning. Verse 34 and 35. Salt is good, but if it has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear salt. Grant Osborne says salt was a precious commodity in the ancient world. Not nearly as accessible as it is today, and it's used in a bunch of different ways. To flavor your food, to preserve your food, as fertilizer, and you added it to grain offerings, and you were sacrificing them as your first fruits to the Lord. The issue of its effect comes when it is mixed or blended with something else. What do you think about that? See, salt begins to lose its effectiveness when it begins to get mixed with something else. If we're called to be salt and light, I want you to think about this. We're called to be salt and light. And if we begin to mix Jesus and the world and all this other stuff with Jesus, we begin to lose our potency and our ability to impact those around us. We become useless. Grant Osborne says this: Jesus' point is that when disciples allow the world to intrude and diminish their effectiveness for Christ, they have lost their saltiness or value to the Lord. John Mason says it this way: anyone who is unwilling to live out what it takes to be a follower lacks the qualities that discipleship requires. He goes on to say, true discipleship, Jesus was saying, both preserves and adds flavor. True disciples are not bland, but have a cutting edge to their lives. These are the qualities we should strive for in our own lives and look for in the lives of professing Christians, close quote. If we're unwilling, think about what John Mason here said. If we are unwilling to do what's necessary, then we lack the qualities of being his disciples. But those who are fully committed, you got to understand, fruit will eventually bud in their life. Daniel Napier says this, and I want to close. But those who are, he says, but the miracle would not have happened apart from decades of humble, faithful work without a visible effect. See, we want things quickly. We're in this microwave society. He said, humble, faithful work over time without any effect. You don't see the fruit yet. He says there's a lag time. Just as iniquity builds up until it suddenly overflows in disaster, right? Iniquity, sin, like how it slowly builds up in our lives and then you see the disaster happen. So too do good and faithful lives suddenly show their latent effect by God's movement. He says, what's the point? I want you to listen to this. Daniel Napier says, no good deed, no small faithfulness is ever wasted. Not ultimately. Not ever. Your acts of faith will have their effect. You can count on it. You can count on it. These are the individuals whose lives are still salty and adding flavor to everything around them. It's reserved for those who have fully committed to his way, his plans, and seeking to learn from him. I'm going to just tell you like this. Don't be salt that has lost its flavor and then thrown away. And I'm going to tell you like Jesus just told them. He says, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. In so many words, if you have the ability to understand what was just said, do that and carefully consider what was said. And as always, I want to leave my blessing with you. Grace, mercy, and peace be with you.